Hey, thanks so much for watching the student podcast, guys. I'm excited because I got my friend Joshua Boyett. He's the lead team coordinator here at Res, and man, just a super good friend of mine. As you notice, he's a fellow hunter. He's got his camo on, his new camo pattern. Yeah, we're gonna go kill an elk this year, so if you're a hunter, leave a comment. Let us know that you're a hunter so we can take you with us, or you can let us hunt your land. So that's
what it's really about.
We're serious. So, anyways, Joshua, would you tell us kind of a little bit about your story? I know you did a Throwback Thursday 3 or 4 weeks ago, and we kind of hear a little bit about what you would have known in high school, but maybe you can kind of give us a little more depth to the story of coming to faith and navigating being a pastor's kid, all that kind of stuff, and just kind of walk us through just a little bit of your story.
Totally. So you already said pastor's kid. I grew up and my dad was a pastor for years before I was even born, and my grandfather is a pastor, my brother's now a pastor, brother-in-law is a pastor. We've got a lot of pastors in our family. So grew up in a really stable home. Parents had a great marriage, a great representation of what that should look like. But you kind of alluded to it already. There's a little bit of pressure that comes with that. Growing up in a small community, I mean, the smallest little thing that I would do wrong, even teachers would be like, well, Joshua, you're a pastor's kid. Shouldn't you know better than to, cut up in class or whatever, the smallest things that other kids were.
A lot of pressure.
Totally. Other kids were getting away with everything. And then, for me, it was a little bit harder to get away with anything. But I had a great childhood, some early preteen years. There's some things that I kind of went through, but really a pretty great childhood overall, and going through kind of a pretty tough phase once I was 14, 15, 16 years old, really trying to discover who I was. That pressure had really started to get to me, and I think there was a little bit of a I'll show you attitude. Look at this pastor's kid and what he can do. And it was a really toxic mindset for me, but I was 14 years old, didn't know any better. But like I said, I had great parents, great influences in my life, but I was really just kind of trying to figure out who I was. How can I separate myself from pastor's kid to actually becoming Joshua? Because that was really important to me, to be somewhat of my own self. But fast forwarding a little bit into college, I was saved when I was 5 years old. First time I said the sinner's prayer. I think the 5th or 6th time I was baptized, I was 10 years old. That may be a slight exaggeration, but I mean that's just kind of what we grew up in. But I don't know that I ever really understood and started connecting with a relationship with Jesus till later on in life. But getting into college, I went to nursing school, and I loved that. I knew from the time I was 13 that I wanted to be a nurse. My grandmother was a nursing instructor, and always told me, she would look at my hands and say, "You've got nurse's hands." And I never really knew what that meant, but she passed away when I was 13, and I knew at that point, I was like, I want to honor her legacy and kind of do this. So I didn't go through general studies or anything from the time I enrolled in college. I knew nursing was what I wanted to do. At that point, I really started, probably the most time I spent away from God was during those times, and still attended church, but never really plugged in. And even attending, I worked 40 hours a week plus 60 hours a week of nursing school, and however many hours are left, I was studying or whatever that looked like.
So it was more busyness that you think made that time away from the Lord, or do you think it was more just growing up in it, you were just kind of...
I think it was a combination of both. I think the busyness was the outward reason. Subconsciously, I think that there was a piece of, I don't know how much I want to be a part of this. I knew that I didn't want to be a pastor. That was immediate. It's like, I don't want to be in the ministry.
Was that pressure to be a pastor there?
I think a little bit. I don't know that it was ever my dad saying, "Hey, you need to be a pastor," or anyone in my life saying, "You need to be a pastor," but it was just kind of assumed that I would be. I was a pretty strong leader throughout my life, and I think there was an obvious calling on my life, but I don't know that there was a whole lot of external pressure. It was more internal pressure, I think, of what I need to live up to and who I need to be. But the busyness helped me kind of lie maybe about what was really going on internally. It's like, oh, well, I got to work to pay bills and I got to do this. And so I was going to a really amazing church in West Monroe, Louisiana, but it was once a month. And then I would go to the young adults thing once a month maybe as well. But I actually, through all this, and this is a huge part of my story of kind of leading up to really coming to a strong place of faith, I got married pretty young. I was still in college. I think it was my final semester of college. Got married, and it was, from the get-go, it was really just pretty toxic. A lot of fighting, a lot of arguing. God was not part of our relationship whatsoever. I was a pretty terrible husband. Blame can be thrown in all sorts of different directions, but I think I'm confident enough to own up to some of the mistakes that I made. But like I said, God wasn't a part. I didn't care a whole lot and was living my life the way that I wanted to. Ended up getting divorced, I think a little over a year and a half into it. And it was pretty clean cut. We didn't own a house. We didn't have family. And though it was mostly my decision to do it, I fell into a deep depression, anger, not really understanding what had happened. Growing up in a pretty strict Christian home, and the culture in the Bible Belt in the South was, you get a divorce, you might as well count it a loss, your life's done. That's the way that I had perceived it. Wow. And so I thought, I'll never amount to anything. And this just shows kind of how bad and toxic it was. I knew all these things ahead of time. It wasn't just like I took marriage, like I took it seriously, but knowing how toxic it was and how bad it was and bad at places I was, I knew the risks and what it meant for my legacy. I knew, I may not ever marry someone that, that sees me the way that I want to be seen. Right. I'll never be in ministry. I knew that for sure. But anyway, cried a lot, didn't sleep a whole lot, really working through this identity thing. I saw myself as an absolute failure. Right. And as a 3 on the Enneagram, like success, or at least appearing successful, is one of the most important things to who we are. So one of the loudest expressions of failure, at least in my opinion at the time, was divorce. And so I didn't want to go to church. I didn't want to see people who loved me. And I found this pattern, which I've talked to you a little bit about before, of this pattern of sabotaging relationships. As soon as people started to get close enough, I'd start pushing them away because I didn't want them to know who I was. I didn't want to see them for who I really was, or at least the way that I viewed myself. Right. But anyway, I read this book by John Bevere, and I'll have to remember the name of it. But
we'll put it in the comments.
We'll put it in the comments once I can remember the name of it. It's that life-changing. But it was really great, and I started reading it, and it completely shifted my perspective. And I went and talked to my parents a good bit and moved back home. So I was living with them for a little while, trying to get back on my feet. And I still didn't really believe that I had a lot of value. But I started getting really involved with the church there, and they actually kind of gave me a little bit of a position in the church, started leading some worship. It was a really great season of growth and healing. I wouldn't say that I was totally thriving there, but was going through some healing and had some parents who loved me and a church who loved me to be able to kind of help me go through some restoration. But I was still broken inside. I ended up moving to Colorado in 2013 to go to the School of Ministry at Res because I just needed away from everything that I'd ever known. And got to the School of Ministry, and life started radically changing. God was speaking to me in ways that he never had. I was starting to believe who I was, but there was this message at the School of Ministry that we were watching one day, and it was basically talking about the self-sabotaging thing that I was discussing earlier. And I had started dating Emily Melson at the time, now Emily Boyett, but I'd started dating her and was scared half to death, filled with fear, anxiety. It had been a couple of years since I had been through my first marriage, and just overwhelming anxiety, seriously, because didn't think this was possible. She was amazing and didn't think I deserved this. Watching this message about self-sabotaging, I immediately realized that I had been destroying all of my previous relationships because I didn't want people to see me the way that I saw myself. And it was in that moment to where I really flipped my perspective, maybe a 180, and started seeing myself the way God saw me. And it was hard. Even though I had this perspective shift, I knew this was truth. Whether it was a full reality in my life or not yet, I knew it was true. And so I started working through that, and that was really the day that I knew, it's like, I'm going to marry this girl. So it was like 10 months later, 8 months later after that we got married, and now I have 3 beautiful children and both on staff at Res, and I couldn't be more thankful for
awesome.
Res believing in me, and my family that helped restore me. So there's really, and if anyone wants, I'm happy to sit down with any of you guys and kind of walk through the more depths of my story, because we could probably spend 4 or 5 hours over coffee and just scratch the surface. But really seeing how God orchestrated a broken human that grew up in a great home but felt the pressures of the world caving in around me and gave into that pressure a little bit, but through some restoration with incredible family and friends that helped me get through it. It was pretty amazing.
So what would you say to a student that maybe feels like they're in that place of self-sabotage? They've grown up in a broken home or maybe even a good home, but they still feel like they're in this place of judging their own value or thinking they're not good enough, and then doing what you said, pushing people away or trying to put on a facade. What would you say to that student that's struggling with that out there?
Yeah. One, I think some of it's decisions that you have to make. Get in the Word, read everything the Bible has to say about identity, but find people in your life that can speak to that as well. I didn't have a lot of people, and I mean, naturally, I was pushing that away. Right. But find someone. There's people in your life that are those kind of people that can speak truth into your life, that are doing life right. Find that person, and I think that's a great place to start. It's easy to say, just believe what God has to say about who you are. Well, that is the most powerful thing that we can do. But until you instill relationships in your life that are going to challenge you and push you toward understanding who you really are and that value, I don't think that some things will stick.
Almost like a reinforcement, having those people remind you of kind of who you are. You know, I feel like for me, I had a similar understanding of identity. It's like I started to read it and I was like, but could this really be, like, does God really think this about me? Right. Does he really care? What about when I still make mistakes? What happens when I mess up? And it's like, but having people that are there that are like, hey, no, that's not who you are, helping to lift you up in those times when you do make mistakes or you do fail, and having people that can push you in the right direction and then remind you, I think has been really critical in my walk. Just having people that can continually push me to be better, and then remind me in the moments where I forget, like, this is who you are, this is what God's called you to do, this is the father that you are, the dad that you are, the friend that you are, the leader, whatever it might be.
Totally.
And so, man, I love that. Thanks so much for being one of those people for me.
Totally.
Being a great friend and jumping on the podcast with us. Students, we hope you enjoyed the podcast. Man, if you guys want to just reach out to either of us or shoot us a comment, leave a comment, let us know what you're struggling with. We'd love to pray for you, pray with you. We believe in you guys. You're amazing. You're killing it. And Joshua, thank you so much for jumping on the student podcast with us, man.
Yeah, bro. Love it.
Y'all have a great day.